Good morning, everyone. How are you feeling today? Yeah, second day of the conference. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Carrie Sampson. I'm an associate professor at Arizona State University, and I had the pleasure of chairing the Early Career Award last year, in which we honored Dr. Travis Bristol with the award, and we are so happy to hear this lecture this morning from him. I'm going to start off with his biography in the introduction and then just say another few other remarks from myself. Dr. Travis J. Bristol is an associate professor of teacher education and education policy in Berkeley School of Education, and by courtesy, the Department of African American Studies. He's also the faculty director of the Center for Research on Expanding Educational Opportunity. His scholarship draws on organizational and sociological frameworks to explore three interrelated research strands: race and gender in schools, national, state, and local policies that enable and constrain the workplace experiences and retention of teachers of color, and district and school-based educator professional learning communities for teachers of color. Dr. Bristol's research has appeared in over 70 peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, policy briefs, and opinion editorials, including Urban Education, the Education Research Journal, Educational Evaluation and Policy Analysis. He has also co-edited 2 volumes, the Handbook of Research on Teachers of Color and Indigenous Teachers, which was published by the American Education Research Association, and Men Educators of Color in the U.S. Public Schools and Abroad, which was published by Routledge. His national awards include both dissertation and postdoctoral fellowships from the National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation and the Ford Foundation, the inaugural Teacher Diversity Research Award from the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education, and the Early Career Award from AERA's Division K. Most recently, he received the UC Berkeley's Chancellor Award for Public Service, Faculty Community Engaged Teaching Award. Dr. Bristol is also the chair of the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards Board of Directors and the first Black person to hold this position in the organization's 38-year history. Dr. Bristol is a former student and teacher in New York City public schools and a teacher educator with the Boston Teacher Residency Program. And I've had the pleasure of interacting with Dr. Bristol a few times. His work is renowned. When I worked with the Arizona Alliance of Black School Educators, and they were working on a teacher pipeline program to increase teacher diversity in Arizona, of course, Dr. Bristol's work came to mind, and we, dug deep into his work around teacher diversity and how to recruit, retain, and create healthy environments for teachers of color. And several of the educators in the room already knew his work and knew of him. And so, he has made a lasting impact in so many communities across the country and throughout the world. And when we reviewed applications, which, we got many applications for the Early Career Award, but of course, Dr. Bristol's application rose to the top, not only because he has published 70 peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and edited volumes, but he really is translating his research to practice and ensuring that people have access to the work that he's doing and really trying to make an impact, and has made an impact in the field. And as just a colleague, I appreciate the way he's created spaces for many of us in this field to guide us, mentor us, and he's mentored me through the postdoctoral fellowships, the Ford and then Spencer, and so I know that many of us rely on him. And he's also brought a huge group of undergraduate students, I believe, right, to AERA for the last couple of years, and so he really is creating a pipeline in this work. And I'm just honored to be here to introduce him. So please, everyone give a round of applause as we start this lecture. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Sampson, for that introduction. Thank you. Amidst the wickedness and evil coming out of Washington, D.C., and the busyness of AERA, thank you for coming this morning. Thank you for coming this morning. I also want to thank the tech team, Guillermo, Ralph, Chris, and Marty for helping calm my nerves and to get all the tech working, so thank you. In some ways, all of this seemed so unlikely 10 years ago. When I was finishing up my doctoral work, I had 0 job prospects, and after 3 years, I finally landed a faculty job. And it was only after my 3rd year on the market that I landed, as I said, a faculty position. And as I've shared with the postdoc, during that faculty position, during my postdoc, I listened to James Cleveland's "I Don't Feel No Ways Tired." Nobody told me this road would be easy, and I listened to that on repeat. But there were mentors, and I'll mention my mentors at the end, but there were mentors along the way who gave me good advice that I took and continue to take. And in many ways, that's among the reasons why I stand before you here today. So I think people have been seeing this kind ask, so if folks want to post, just feel free to talk to me after. As Dr. Sampson said, some of my undergrads who are in my course this semester convinced me that it was a good idea to get on a 5:30 a.m. flight yesterday. And after you come to AERA so many times, it gets hard to sort of feel energized, but I'm channeling some of you all's undergrad energy. So Angelica, Dalia, Rachel, Teresa, Jason, Althea, Rocky, Sarah, Natalia, I'm channeling you all this morning. So as someone who grew up in a Baptist church, I learned that any good sermon or talk had 3 points. And so this talk is organized around these sort of 3 points, or these 3 parts rather. And in the first part, I'll talk about my early formations in diasporic disconnection across the Black Atlantic. I am the son of South American immigrants who was born and raised in Brooklyn and grew up visiting family members in cities across 3 continents, Montreal, London, and Georgetown. In part 2, I'll share briefly some of the findings from my research studies over this last decade on the experiences of Black teachers in several US urban centers: Boston, Massachusetts, New York City, Jackson, Mississippi, Omaha, Nebraska, and Oakland, California. And in part 3, I will then make a diasporic turn informed by my early experiences to share emerging research on the school-based experiences of teachers of African descent across 4 Latin American countries: Brazil, Colombia, Panama, and Uruguay. So there were early formations of diasporic disconnection and connections, traversing what Paul Gilroy would theorize as the Black Atlantic. I was born in Brooklyn, New York, to Afro-Guyanese parents. And I spent summers in elementary and middle and high school visiting family members, as I said earlier, in Georgetown, Guyana, London, England, and Montreal, Canada. And on the one hand, I was aware that my family members and I were disconnected by citizenship to a shared nation state, which is to say that I saw myself as American, and I was reminded that I was American by my parents and my grandparents, and I saw my relatives as Guyanese, British, and Canadian. And there were moments when I also heard as a high schooler in Brooklyn from my Guyanese grandfather these fantastic stories of being related to Bishop Samuel Ajayi Crowther, who was the first bishop of the Anglican Church who served in modern-day Nigeria in the mid-1800s. A lot of sort of animations here. Paul Gilroy, in his seminal text, The Black Atlantic, invites us to reimagine people of African descent, or Black people's connection, not to a particular nation state, which is to say Black American or Black British or Black Guyanese, but rather through a shared connection of Black identity and culture, born out of a shared experience of being enslaved and transported across the Atlantic. And while I understood and saw myself as American and my relatives as Canadian, Guyanese, and British, I was also aware, beyond familial kinship, that there were sort of these shared racialized and cultural experiences. For example, when I was in elementary school, I remember visiting family members in Montreal. And when hanging out with a cousin, I heard him speaking French, specifically Quebecois. Now, to a group of white friends, I, of course, was surprised that my cousin, who was my age, spoke another language, because every time we communicated, he spoke to me in English. I didn't know that people in Canada spoke a language other than English. But after inquiring about that interaction, he mentioned that as a Black person, one of the ways that he attempted to fit into school was through learning Quebecois. And in middle school, I remember visiting Guyana for a cousin's wedding. And the night before the wedding, seeing with awe and amazement drums and sticks and drumming, and the search for this elusive bride by the bridegroom and his family. In Guyana, it's called the kwekwe or kakale, which I later learned had its roots in West Africa. And years later, I had my own kwekwe in Brooklyn. And as a college student, when I visited England, I learned from cousins about the signs that their parents saw when they arrived to London in the 60s. No Irish, no Blacks, no dogs. I also remember family members describing the discrimination that they experienced by teachers and peers in primary and secondary school. My colleague Deron Wallace's work on the experiences of Afro-Caribbeans in England further underscores this point. On average, I shelved further inquiry into these diasporic noticings and blunted inquiry about understanding connections and disconnections when I began my doctoral work. As an early career scholar, my research focused exceptionally on the US. And some of this was out of practicality. I was doing my doctoral work at Teachers College, Columbia University, and conducting US-based research was easier than doing international research. And I believed real and imagined in US exceptionalism. There were, however, these early academic imprints of thinking diasporically. In 2011, when I was at Teachers College, Columbia University, I took Manning Marable's course, Living Black History. And he reminded us that while the class had focused on people of African descent in the US, the experiences were not unique to people of African descent in the US, which was a lesson that he learned from Walter Rodney, whose position he filled at Cornell, which I didn't know. And Rodney, as some of you may know, was the Afro-Guyanese scholar who published How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Sadly, when I was in actually Manning Marable's course that semester, he transitioned. And he actually transitioned 2 days before his biography on Malcolm X was published. But one important lesson from Marable's class that was of great importance that I began to learn but I continued to hold on to was the importance of centering Black people. Truly and unapologetically centering Black people in my scholarship. White people and their experiences did not have to be the reference group. And so my initial work was born out of a wondering about whether policymakers were asking the right questions. In 2009, when then U.S. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan goes to Morehouse College, as many of you may know, it's the nation's only historically black all-male college. Secretary Duncan goes to Morehouse College and he launches the department's teacher diversity campaign, calling black men to the blackboard. And as a former K-12 teacher, I knew that understanding why teachers left the profession was as important, if not more so, than recruiting teachers. And so I set out to understand why black men teachers left the profession. And because of my coursework in sociology and work theory, I knew that comparisons as a unit of analysis were important when conducting rigorous research. So I set out to understand why black men teachers in urban schools move schools and the profession. And I should just note to say that I draw on Milner's and Lomatoy's definition of urban schools beyond schools located in densely populated spaces. These schools are also characterized by the diversity of students across religion, language, ethno-racial identity. And these schools are on average often more resource constrained. So to understand black men teacher turnover in urban schools, I compared black men to black men. But I use as my unit of comparison urban schools with one black man teacher versus schools with 3 or more black men teachers. And in that work, I conceptualized this term loner to refer to black men who were the only black men on their faculty, to groupers. Black men in schools with 3 or more black men teachers. And groupers cited these sort of challenging working conditions, such as weak administrative leadership, as their primary reason for wanting to leave. The following year, almost half of these teachers, 9 out of 20, did not return to their schools in the positions they held the previous year. And counterintuitively, loners, despite having these hostile interactions with their white colleagues, they stayed. My work also explored the experiences of black men pre-service teachers. Although a growing body of research highlights the challenges pre-service black teachers experience in their preparation programs, there is less research about how preparation programs can create supportive environments for aspiring black teachers, and specifically black men teachers. And sort of to fill this empirical gap, my co-authors and I asked, how do black men pre-service teachers describe the role of an affinity group in shaping their experience in their preparation programs and in their clinical sites? Affinity group participants communicated that their needs openly with one another and with facilitators, and they talked about how they felt solidarity with each other, which allowed for collaborative problem solving and cultivated tools for self-advocacy to meet both their personal and their professional goals. Another article explores culturally responsive professional development for black men teachers in the southeastern part of the United States. This PD, organized by a national teachers union, highlights the intentional focus on addressing participants' social and emotional needs. The findings revealed that the program provided a supportive space for teachers to share their challenges and bond with each other, resulting in changes in their teaching practice. For example, teachers described learning about students' home lives and how to connect that learning to what and to how they taught. My research has also explored the school-based experiences of teachers of color in a small Midwestern urban district. Large-scale research has not explored educators' on-the-job interactions with colleagues outside of large urban districts. And so this research, looking at a small Midwestern urban school district, begins to add to the literature on educator diversity. Where staff of color were the only faculty members of color, and where a math professional development and curricular change were district-wide foci, staff of color were less likely to seek out help from their colleagues. Staff of color were less likely to seek out help for their colleagues. Now, what's important to note in this study was that staff of color were generally not sought for advice any more or less than their white colleagues. So their white colleagues were coming to them, but they did not seek out help from their white colleagues. In one study under review with my UC Berkeley doctoral students Ashley Zhao and postdoc Christine Quince examines the working conditions of alternatively certified teachers, most of whom are people of color. And we found that there were a set of practices that administrators enacted that alternatively certified teachers said encouraged them to stay, namely regular check-ins, viewing teachers as holistic learners, and encouraging self-care. Principals who did not respect teachers' autonomy and cultivated a negative school culture were less favored by teachers, and these teachers were more likely to say that they would leave. And so over this decade, I've attempted to add to the literature on the experiences of in-service and pre-service teachers of African descent in the US, and in so doing, building on the work of Michelle Foster and Marvin Lynn and Leslie Fenwick and Dorinda Carter and Mary Dilworth and Gloria Ladson-Billings and Anthony Brown and Cynthia Dillard and Kefferlin Brown and Rich Milner. And after tenure, thank God for tenure, and after tenure in 2021, I began to think about what was next. What questions keep me up? And my partner Talani asked another question. She asked, what's your passion? What do you want to learn more about? And that got me thinking about my noticings through travel in Latin America. After studying abroad in Spain during college, one of the ways that I attempted to maintain my spoken Spanish fluency has been by traveling in Latin America. In a second, I'll play a video of my son, then 2, in 2009, during our weekend visit to Montevideo, Uruguay, which is about an hour ferry ride from Buenos Aires, Argentina, where we had spent most of our time. Now, before my visit, I honestly knew very little about Uruguay. But throughout the capital city, Montevideo, I saw Black people and Black culture on public display. And here, in a second, you'll see a group of men playing candombe, an Afro-Uruguayan cultural and historic tradition that has its origins from enslaved Africans who played candombe overtly and covertly as a form of resistance from their Spaniard enslavers. Of course, there were some healthy libations in addition to the drumming, no judgments on our parenting, but it was during visits to Argentina and Uruguay and Peru, it's through these personal visits that I began to sort of think back to Talani's question about what do you want to learn more about? And because I had been studying teachers of African descent in the US, I now wanted to engage in a diasporic project, specifically to learn more about teachers of African descent across Latin America. Let me say that this project and the forthcoming research that will come out of it would not have been done without the incredible support of research assistants at UC Berkeley, Maria Rojas Concha, Darius Gordon, and Henrique Menzies. And so with their support, I set out to identify a set of focus countries. Now, to select a group of 4 countries or so across the 30-plus countries in the region, I drew on some previous frameworks about numerical composition and numerical representation. And in particular, I selected countries in which people of African descent were in the minority. Then I ranked those countries from high to low percentage of people of African descent who were in the minority. So first was Colombia, where people of African descent account for roughly about 10% of the population. And then Panama, where people of African descent are roughly about 10% of the population. And then finally Uruguay, where people of African descent are roughly about 8% of the population. And while people of African descent are slightly the majority in Brazil, from the research literature, I was aware that they still occupied a marginal status in the country. So I included Brazil as well. So the study has 4 research questions. The first question, what are the school-based experiences of teachers of African descent in Colombia, Brazil, Panama, and Uruguay? To what degree do the school-based experiences of teachers in these countries vary? How, if at all, do teachers of African descent across these 4 countries learn here to design lessons about the historical and the contemporary experiences of Black people? And then this final question, and this is what I'll spend my time talking about here today. How, if at all, do teachers of African descent in Colombia, Brazil, Panama, and Uruguay design and enact lessons about the historical and the contemporary experiences of Black people? So to recruit participants, we use snowball sampling. We share this flyer with members in our professional and social networks. These networks, I believe Jose probably may have sent you a flyer. These networks led to online groups for teachers of African descent in each of our focus countries. And some of the inclusionary criteria was that a teacher had to teach in a primary or secondary school, and these schools could be public or private. So data were collected over the course of 2 years, beginning in summer 2021 through summer 2023. And that included 1 round of semi-structured interviews. Each interview lasted roughly about an hour via Zoom. We compensated the participants in our study, so we paid each participant $25 US. We also asked participants for artifacts from their classroom. Enrique conducted the interviews in Portuguese, Maria the interviews in Spanish, and we also conducted classroom observations. So we interviewed, the interview transcripts were translated by a professional translator from Spanish and Portuguese into English. We read and reread the transcripts in context summary forms for overall meaning, developed a code book, employed academic coding, and used MaxQDA, qualitative data analysis software. So in total, we interviewed 70 teachers, 19 in Brazil, 22 in Colombia, 14 in Panama, and 16 in Uruguay. We also spent time in teachers' classrooms. So I conducted the classroom observations of the 2 teachers in Brazil, the 2 teachers in Colombia. Maria visited the teachers in Panama, and I conducted the classroom observations for the teachers in Uruguay. And so the question that I'll focus on today, some of our emerging findings, again, is this question here. How, if at all, do teachers of African descent in Colombia, Brazil, Panama, and Uruguay enact lessons about the historical and the contemporary experiences of Black people? I want to say, to inform my working analysis of how teachers of African descent in Colombia, Brazil, Panama, and Uruguay design and enact lessons, I draw on the scholarship, both historical and contemporary, that are also diasporic in their orientation. So Paul Gilroy's Anglophone work, The Black Atlantic, the work of Francophone writers such as Amy César, who birthed the negritude movement in the early 1900s. Jose has been helpful here. More contemporary scholarship, or Norman Whitten and Arlene Torres and Miriam Jimenez and Juan Flores on the people of African descent in Latin America and the US. And at its core, this sort of diasporic scholarship, it centers the experiences of people of African descent, and it rejects the marginal and the subjugated position that European colonizers used to define Black people. This scholarship seeks to uplift and to reinstill Black people, pride in Black people and people of African descent. And I employ this sort of diasporic frame to assist me in making sense of how teachers of African descent across these 4 countries are working to center Blackness for their students And this centering, while starting locally, these teachers are constantly connecting this work to the African diaspora and across the African diaspora. So what did I find? First, I found, and I'll go into detail for each. First, I found that the teachers in our study, that they were able to connect everyday cultural practices to people of African descent. And they were also able to connect to students' funds of knowledge. During our interviews, we saw that they centered the experiences of Black people of cross-African descent in the US. But then when we visited their classrooms, we saw something quite different. We saw that they were centering the experiences of national and international persons of African descent. So the first finding, Ariana, a history teacher in Panama, we found that she was connecting everyday experiences, cultural practices to people of African descent. So she says in the interview, I tell them that the yam was brought to Panama by African women in the 16th century. So the sancocho, which is like a chicken stew, the sancocho is made with chicken and yams and nothing else, chicken and chicken meat and yam. And then the yam gives that touch, that thickness to the sancocho. And I say that when you are eating a sancocho, you are eating an Afro-descendant contribution. And so here we see Ariana reminding her students that this very dish, this everyday practice of eating sancocho was actually a uniquely African dish. When I visited Manuel's classroom in Montevideo, in June 2023, during the field observation to Manuel's classroom, and his class took place at the House of the Afro-Uruguayan Culture House, and he teaches candombe. I asked him why he teaches candombe to Uruguayans who are not of African descent. And he said that one goal of his is to transmit Uruguayan culture to other Uruguayans, and that candombe is Uruguayan culture. He also said, which I thought was quite interesting, that women, in his opinion, were more likely to be interested in learning the history of candombe, and the men were more interested in learning the techniques of how to play the drum. There was also this connection to students' funds of knowledge. Jose, an English teacher, by the way, these are all pseudonyms. Jose, an English teacher, said, sometimes I choose people from students' environments that have stood out for one reason or another, whether in the arts or in sports or in academics. And it's a way to connect people with our reality, because then the students question himself. Who is Choco Cape Town, for example? And that generated a space where you can start to tell something a little, even it's very minimal, about who represents us in other areas. So just a note here, and you'll see Choco. It's on the western coast of Colombia. It's on the Pacific coast of Colombia, and that's where a large number of people of African descent live. Choco is the state, and Quibdó is the capital. And so in a second, you'll hear a musical artist. Choco Cape Town is actually the name of an Afro-Uruguayan musical artist, a musical group. And so what you hear Jose doing is knowing that Choco Cape Town, it's a famous group, that he's inviting students, their connections to this group as a way to help them understand the experiences of people of the African diaspora.
Somos pacíficos, Choco Town. Somos pacíficos, estamos unidos, nos une la región, la pinta, la raza y el don del sabor. Somos pacíficos, estamos unidos, nos une la región, la pinta, la raza y el don del sabor.
So we are Pacific, we are united, we are joined by the region, that style, the race, and the gift of flow. And for Jose, who recognizes that his students were familiar with the Chakop Cape Town group presents an opportunity for them to talk about the contemporary experiences of people of African descent, the style, the race, the gift of flow. Similarly, when I visited Alma's classroom in Sao Paulo, Alma was teaching, she was a history teacher, and students were working on an immigration unit. And for the final project, students were rehearsing a series of dances. And for Alma, the selection of a series of songs that speak to the migration of people of African descent from Africa to Brazil was how she organized, right, the students' performances. And so I think this clip will work. You'll see in the first song, students are rehearsing Jerusalema. And for Alma, the students rehearsing and students choosing her decision to have students dance to Jerusalema was connected to this idea of telling a story of Black life and Black joy and what life was like for Black people before the transatlantic slave trade. Another song that students learned to dance to was Ai Carne. The song, it's from a Brazilian artist, and it talks about the devaluation of Black life in Brazil. And so she creates a series of songs. The first song, Jerusalema, Black joy, Black people before the transatlantic slave trade, and then other songs that talk about oppression for Black people in Brazil. But the work, the diasporic work, right, is a way to connect the students' funds of knowledge, given that students were familiar with Jerusalema. So this sort of third finding was that during our interviews, it appeared that teachers, rightfully so, they were centering the experiences of people of African descent in the US. So Sumaya talked about how, and for this film of Hidden Figures, there I tell you that I make up a soup of these three women and I look at what they did to make Nassau what it is today. She's talking about Hidden Figures in Nassau. Yasmin in Brazil says, for example, I will give you an example of what happens in the classroom. Nazism, it's a subject that needs to be taught. It's an important part of the curriculum. I can teach Nazism. And within that lesson, I can bring the example, ask a question about Jesse Owens, that Black African-American runner who will win the Munich Olympics. And then Diana, 17 and 18, in years 2017, 2018, when I worked with high school kids, then I realized that many did not even know who Martin Luther King was. So she's in Panama, surprised that our students don't know who Martin Luther King is, which I thought that everyone knows who he is. And many had not even heard who he was, and I took the initiative to show them the story. And so in our interviews, right, when we asked teachers, talk about the content that you're teaching, the content seemed to be really focused. They seemed to talk a great deal about how they were making connections to people of African descent in the US. But then when we visited their classrooms, right, what we found was that in fact they were actually making connections to what was happening locally. So in 2022, when I visited Bogota, it was in the middle of the presidential campaign, the presidential election. And the president the leader of the opposition selected Francia Marquez to be his vice presidential candidate. And about the week before I arrived, a famous singer referred to Francia Marquez as King Kong. And so in the class, the teacher, Isabella, said, racism, these are her words, racism is not a thing that exists only in the US, but also here in Colombia. Several months later, Francia Marquez is elected the first Black vice president of Colombia. In her next period class, she's also talking about epistemic racism, and students are reading Chimamanda Adichie's The Dangers of a Single Story. So here, right, making this connection while talking about racism is making this connection to the work of this Nigerian writer. When I visited Margarita's class in Montevideo, she was teaching on that day, on the board you actually see her notes, she's teaching a lesson on South Africa and apartheid, and she's walking students through how South Africa arrived at then apartheid, and she talks about the Dutch War, the War of the Boers, the ANC Congress, apartheid segregation. And then after class, I turn around and I began just looking on her walls, and I see student work on the walls. And these are student presentations, and after class I asked her to say more about what the assignments were, and she said that what she did was she asked students had to create an assignment where they had to identify someone that they knew who was a sports figure who had experienced some type of racism. So one student, you'll see, one student did a project on Deborah Rodriguez, who is an Afro-Uruguayan runner who faced discrimination. Another student did a presentation, did their assignment on Mario Balotelli, an Italian soccer player who also faced discrimination. And what Margarita said was that she used the sort of local knowledge, this idea, what students' awareness of what was happening locally as a scaffold to help them understand how the South African government, the former South African government, could enact apartheid in the country. But she was, again, across all of these classes, there was very little discussion around what was happening in the US, but a lot of discussion around what was happening locally, or what was happening in other places outside of the US. Finally, during my 2023 visit to Montevideo, I spent time in Lola's class. And that day, her elementary students were learning about the importance of names and the naming of people of African descent beyond Negro, or black. And so to do this, she talks about the well-known revolutionary hero, also known as one of the founders, José Artigas. Artigas' companion, or formerly enslaved African, is known in Uruguay, is known throughout Uruguay as El Negro Ancina. And to the left, you'll see a statue of both men. Artigas is sitting down, and quote unquote, El Negro Ancina is the one sort of standing up. Looks like he's bringing him something there. And during this lesson, this is an elementary classroom, she teaches students that the historic and the contemporary name of El Negro Ancina is pejorative. And she tells students that his name is Joaquin Lenzina. She also troubles the image on the left where Lenzina is standing and seemingly serving Artigas. And she compares it to a recently erected statue of Lenzina on the right, which was really inspired by the Afro-Uruguayan community there, where you see Lenzina sitting and taking his seat, almost as another one of the country's founders. She also troubles the use of negrito, small black boy, or negrita, small black girl, and how it robs people of African descent of their identity. At one moment in the class, there's a student, he raises his hand, I believe it's a he raised his hand. She asked students if they are familiar with the term, and many students share that they are. And there was, at one point, a student I said raised his hand, and he said that his uncle's name is Negro. And Lola urges the student to ask his grandmother what's his uncle's real name, because the student only referred to his uncle as Negro. And for Lucia, as we discussed during our one-on-one debrief of her class, that this is what resistance looks like for her, going beyond merely describing El Negro Encina, but having students name him Joaquin Lenzina. And as I learned when visiting classrooms and watching the teachers' practice and students' practice, I also learned that students are also watching me. At the end of one class during my visit to Hector's classroom in Bogota, a student slipped me this note, and it says, I think you probably can see it a little bit there. The note says, "Hello, Professor Travis, how are you? Sorry, I don't know how to say it. I want to tell you that you are a great teacher. I hope your research goes well." So I'll end by underscoring that while the data collection is on average complete, that the analysis is very much in process. And that it is this project and the writing of this project is what I'll spend a great deal of my time during this next career stage trying to answer these three questions. And I started by thanking some mentors. I said I wouldn't have gotten here if I didn't have folks who gave me advice, who told me to put my head down and write, who created opportunities for me. And so I want to just acknowledge some mentors, and then some scholar siblings. Carolyn Reel, Aaron Pallas, Yolanda Silva Ruiz, Carla Shed, who were on my committee, my dissertation committee. Linda Darling Hammond, who, when I couldn't find a job, provided an opportunity for me to become a postdoc. Prudence Carter, who gave me some of the best professional advice I've ever had. She said, "Put your head down and write. Put your head down and write." Mentors who continue to give me good advice, who continue to write for me: Deborah Ball, Marvin Lynn, Tyrone Howard, Rich Milner, Naila Nasir, Frank Worrell, my colleagues Frank Worrell, Rebecca Chung, Jabari Mahiri, Maria Heiler, Susan Moore Johnson, Brian Brown, Anthony Brown, my scholar siblings, Duran Wallace, Rod Carey, Cesare Warren, Joseph Nelson, Connor Giss, Tim Madkins, Shannon White, Marcel Mentor, Dorinda White. And also a special note of gratitude to Carolyn Yu, who was a undergraduate research assistant who helped me with all the animations. I also want to thank my children. This is a picture of Peter, my son, 2009. We were in front of the Republican Bank of Uruguay. And then we went back again in 2023. Gratitude for them being so willing to just take up and go. I think there was some gratitude. I think there was some excitement and gratitude on his part, less so on my daughter's. And that look of a 13-year-old who did not want to be in Brazil or Uruguay. I just wanted to be in her house playing her games. But gratitude for my children being voluntold to come travel and engage and support this work. And then finally, my life partner, Talani, who continues to sacrifice much. Who is my colleague at Cal, but my life partner first and foremost. I'm grateful for her immense love, kindness, her message this morning to just have fun, for her giving me constant feedback on my work. And so that is where I will end. And I think you've asked me should I just open it up for questions? Okay. I guess I'll open up for questions.
Hi, Dr. Bristol. Dr. Wilson here. And I think my biggest question, I mean, yes, phenomenal. Thank you for all of that, because everybody needs to see that. I'm curious about how you're thinking about all the work outside of academia and how that either influences and or is influenced by your research agenda. Because, I mean, your roster, even outside of academia, is pretty phenomenal. So for folks in the audience who are like listening and trying to get a good sense of where their career could possibly be going or the prospects that they'd like to take on, how do you see, whether it's your work with National Board or all the advisories and all the state work that you've been doing, in addition to the national work? I'd be curious as to how those elements are shaped or get shaped by the things that you do within your research agenda and academia.
Thank you for that, Dr. Wilson. So, I think that some of my research is really shaped by this deep connection to practice, and so. Because I care deeply, I think that one goal of research is to give people tools to actually do something with what you find, right? And so because of all of the work, like National Board, where we both serve, the various boards that I serve on, that I'm constantly thinking about, well, if I find X, or how might this finding of X, or how might these questions around X, support what teachers are doing in their classroom. And so, some of the findings that I shared here around, tapping into teachers students as sort of funds of knowledge, connecting to these everyday experiences, right? It's really an attempt to support what's happening in classrooms, because I spend so much time, I would say on average, right, thinking about practice and working with practitioners.
Hi, Dr. Bristol. Kind of nervous. You're a big deal to me. It's an honor to be in your presence, and thank you for your work. So
I'm probably more nervous than you, so it's.
I don't think so. My name's Colin Perryman. I'm a postdoc at Johns Hopkins.
Oh.
And like you mentioned, Leslie Fenwick, I've been going through a lot of her work on Black educators, as well as yours. I've been talking with her a lot about the health implications of the firing of the 100,000 Black educators of last century. In your work, in your data, have you seen any synergies or relationships in terms of health writ large, in the narratives of the teachers or the students, in your data of foodways, of healthcare workers? Have you seen if there's a density of Black educators, a better health situations, either in the US or abroad, in the whole diaspora at large? It's vague questions, I apologize. In short, what have you seen in terms of the impact of Black educators and the health of the community, of the Black community at large, in your data?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. No, I think it's an important one. So, I would say that a way that Black teachers, both in the U.S. and in the countries, in some of these the countries where we've collected data, I would say that we often found teachers for our study because they were in these sort of what we would call these sort of professional learning groups, these sort of social groups for Black educators. And so both in the U.S. and outside of the U.S., that it's that these kinds of professional learning communities, these sort of social networks for teachers of African descent and Black teachers, has been a way for them to attend to the the challenges that they experience, the macro and racialized aggressions that they experience from their colleagues and their students, that these spaces have really attended to that. And so, so the answer, yes, and being agentic, these educators have found their way into spaces that provide some measure of healing. And I would say that, it was rather remarkable to sit across from a teacher in Bogota and have a teacher who's phenotypically, right, would show up just like me in the world, and have him say how painful it was to hear his colleagues refer to students as monkeys. And that was very similar to what I heard a black teacher in Boston say when I interviewed him for my dissertation in, 2013, when he said, when he overheard his colleagues say, oh, the students are behaving like monkeys. And so I think that I appreciate the question, both what's happening here and abroad, because this project is really an attempt to help us understand that there was a same ship, if you will. It docked at different locations, and some of the experiences, not all, but some of the experiences, by dint of being black, by dint of being in the minority, are shared. And because of where we sit in the US, we may be less familiar about those experiences. And as you heard from the teachers and what they're teaching their students, they're very familiar with what's happening here in the US. This light's terrible.
Hello, my name is Deborah. It's good to see you again. Thank you so much for your presentation. So I'm a second-year doc student at the University of Maryland in College Park, and my interest is in thinking about retention and the recruitment of Black teachers. And I've been learning, just like taking one of my classes, just thinking about the concept of like Afro-pessimism and social death and like Black aliveness. And so thinking about the work that you're doing and connecting teachers of African descent and seeing how they show up in their classrooms and things like that. I'm wondering about, as someone who is studying the retention of teachers in spaces that don't always like honor them or their legacies or their histories. I'm just wondering, like, in your work, how do you kind of see that coming to fruition in a way, or how do you see, and I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of like Black aliveness or just like, social death and thriving even in the midst of a lot of difficulty. And so I'm just wondering, like, did you see any of that in your interviews, or do you have any thoughts about what that looks like specifically, because schools have not always been safe spaces for people of African descent?
Yeah. So I thank you for the question. So my sense was that particularly at least across the teachers this small group of teachers that we interviewed and in the classrooms the classrooms that I observed, there seemed, and I should say that, of course, these teachers are a group of teachers who who participated in a whole series of professional learning communities were in professional circles where they developed a sense of agency, right? But there was a sense of maybe an agentic orientation to how they organized their classrooms that I thought was quite profound, that there was this sense that teachers were positioning that, yes, right, that there is, that we are, well aware of the work of clearly Afro-pessimism, right? But there was also this sense that that Black culture and life could and should be celebrated. And it's not to disregard the reality of what was happening, but there was a sense that that there was an awareness of creating conditions where Black people and Black life could be celebrated. I think it's also important to note, there's also some historical context, there's so much you can put in this kind of presentation like this. Colombia and Brazil both have, there's legislation in the country that mandates what we would term in the US like a Black Studies curriculum.
Okay.
So these are national laws that were passed. And both countries, Colombia and Brazil, see this Black Studies, this focusing on Black Studies curriculum in K-12 schools, while it may not be implemented with fidelity, but they see it as a form of reparations to people of African descent. And so there is at least some cover, right? There's at least some cover because there's a law that says you have to teach Black Studies, where teachers can lean into and think more expansively that beyond some of the challenging social conditions that allow Black people to arrive to those spaces, they're also thinking more imaginatively about joy and thriving, if you will.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Warren.
Good morning. Thank you so much for this. This is fabulous, and this is great to see how your work is evolved and continue to grow and have great impact. And you mentioned Michelle Foster's work, and I remember reading that work as an undergraduate, preparing to teach and thinking about this fundamental role of Black educators pre-Brown. And I saw echoes of what I learned in reading her book in 25 years ago to what you've presented today. And it's brilliant to see how it's just continued to, those connections are made. Similar to the question that was asked, one thing that I'm sitting with relative to what we know about, as what I've come to understand is Black suffering being landscaped to education writ large, and generally landscaped to Black life across the Americas. I don't think it's limited to the geopolitical context that is the US. I'm wondering in your work, as you thought about across these national contexts, what sort of threats are these teachers facing, and or what dilemmas or tensions are they having to navigate to be able to do the work that you've documented here? And what sort of, and I'm thinking a little bit about Jarvis Gibbons' work and just the sort of fugitive nature of Black teachers over time to know the conditions that they're in and still find ways to espouse cultural pride and love and joy. But I think it's really important to continue to talk through what the tensions and dilemmas are and how your work is sort of taking those up or responding or thinking with those tensions and giving us a robust sort of depiction of these Black teachers and their work. Thank you.
I appreciate that, and I think it's really context, of course, dependent. And I think it may have appeared as I placed every place as a broad stroke or as a similar context. I think it varies by context. In places like Colombia and Brazil, like I mentioned earlier, because at least there is this national law that allows for the teaching of Black studies, there is this cover. Now, what the teachers that we interviewed, what they have said is that it's clearly not implemented with fidelity, that they feel like they're the only person who's studying or teaching about Black culture in their schools. So I think that that's important as well. I think that in Uruguay, for example, as long as we have the physical education teacher, AKA the candombe teacher, do candombe, then we're doing Black studies, right? And so it operates, or it's revealed as or seen as this singular art form, right? Rather than teaching about that one of the reasons why Uruguay has a large number of people of African descent is because of migrant patterns. People from Brazil, right, migrated to Uruguay. And so you don't have that sort of, in places like Uruguay, that sort of robust teaching of history. It's just limited to this one content, physical education. But I would say on average that there are some of the connections, so those are some of the disconnections. Some of the connections are that the teachers of African descent across these countries are underrepresented in their schools, right? So there's a demographic mismatch, that their colleagues hold anti-Black views of the Black children. They see their the Black teachers would say that their colleagues see them as being outliers, right? That they just seem to be unique and not representative of Black people. And so I think and I think that these teachers, and that may well be the reason why, again, this purposive sampling of teachers, right, that we got who are from these professional learning communities that serve Black people, right, that they are aware of these issues. I would also say that for what was also interesting, this is probably research question number 3 about how people learn these practices, not how they enact. But they would say writ large that they did not learn they learned very little about the experiences of Black people in their teacher preparation programs. I mean, that sounds quite familiar on average to some programs here in the US, right? But that they learned about how to enact, to create these learning environments that centered Black people and Blackness. They learned it through these community-based organizations, these teacher networks that they've been a part of that center Black people. And so I think that continues to be the tension, because if teachers aren't learning how to center Blackness, how to teach a Black studies curriculum that's mandated in teacher preparation programs, right, then if it's not being taught in teacher preparation programs, then teachers writ large won't teach it. They won't learn it. And we can't relegate teaching of Black history to after-school programs or to these sort of like out of these professional learning networks or these cultural programs, right?
Hi, Travis. Thank you for this speech. My name is Stefan Vincent Lancreen. I'm
Oh yes, OECD.
Senior OECD. Yes. So thank you for mentioning that how the Black US history and culture is very central to people living elsewhere, and thank you for your reciprocal interest in what is happening elsewhere. I have 2 questions. One is on actually the first part of your research, and I was wondering if you found similar dynamics among the teachers. What you find in the US, in terms of how Black teachers in a minority school, etc., how they behave, and similar kinds of things in the other countries. And the second question is about the variation within countries, because if you're in Bogota or Cartagena, the Black population is not as important. If you're in the Nordeste in Brazil or in Santa Catarina, it's a very different story as well. And I wondered whether you would be interested also in looking at how white teachers actually respond to the presence of Black students, pupils, in their class when they actually teach these kind of questions. And I'm saying that, because as a personal anecdote, I grew up in France, and actually I've never had a single Black teacher, neither female or male. So that's. However, there was actually Black culture in my school, and my English teacher taught us Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison, and probably not just to me, to everyone. We studied Aimé Césaire, and there is no obligation whatsoever to have that in the curriculum, except in history. And so, I was thinking that, in fact, it's not just the teachers who bring, there is an interaction between the teachers and the students, and possibly when you have a minority of, students of color, all the teachers may actually respond and change their way of centering, Black culture to their classrooms.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for the question. There's a lot. I'll start with the question about white teachers. Some of my U.S. work has started to think a little bit about the experiences of white leaders and white teachers, right, who create the conditions that black teachers say harm them and harm black children. I'm not there yet, right, with the sort of international work, but I do think it's an important question. My colleague James Noonan and I, we had a session yesterday. We've been writing we now have 2 papers where I had him, he is white, I had him, right, interview white teachers and white leaders, and I think we got a different story than probably what they would have shared with me, which I think is really important. So it's something that I've been thinking about in the US context, not outside of the US. To the question about variation, so absolutely. In, for example, Colombia, where the majority of black people live on the coast, right, in Chocó. One of the things that we found was that there was almost clearly that the teachers who were in Bogota felt like they had to sort of, Bogota, which is the capital of Colombia, that in their coming to the capital, right, as they come to, right, the ville, that they had to, that there was a sense of having to be more intentional about code switching, and I don't want to say, it would be incorrect to say that they would water down, but they were more attuned to having to pass, right, in ways that they did not when they were teaching in predominantly black communities, where they were only teaching black students, where most of their colleagues were black. And so I think that and of course, right, one of the things that I learned is that the black population in Colombia, right, it's not just enslaved Africans who were brought to Colombia by the Spanish, right, that you also have, particularly on the coast, in Chocó, that video, right, where I showed you, very similar to Panama and Costa Rica, individual black people of African descent moving from the Caribbean, right, to Colombia as well. So they're in many ways they've arrived as immigrants to Colombia, and that also changes their how they see their connection to black people and their experiences in the country. So I think there was absolutely variation across our countries, similar to Panama, right? In Panama, you have and people talk about being descendants of enslaved Africans, and then you have black people in Panama talking about coming over. They were brought as laborers over to build the Panama Canal, right? And so they have 2 very different identities. And here, I've just sort of presented people of African descent in sort of very broad strokes because of time. But I thank you for the question because there is a great deal of nuance. And to the other question about similarities, I mean, I think I shared some of this earlier, that by dint of being viewed as black, as well as identifying as black, that there were some that black teachers in the study experienced, like I said earlier, right, macro and microaggressions navigating through school when they were in elementary school. Very similar stories to when I would interview teachers in some of my earlier work in Boston, right, around the kinds of racist comments that they experienced. I think that's some of the diasporic connection that I hope to bring attention to. Let me just say this, it seems like we're probably running up on time. For those of you who are interested in thinking about or interested in this conversation globally, next week, I think it's next week, my colleague Tia Matkins and I are going to be in conversation with colleagues at UCL, University College of London, Carolyn Daly and Mark Hardman. Those of you who follow UK politics will know that the UK, they've recently, after having a conservative government for many, many years, they recently had a Labour government. Maybe 3 years ago, I gave a lecture at UCL during the Biden administration, and I heard my colleagues at UCL say things like, we can't teach certain topics, that you can't talk about critical race theory. And I was, this seems so foreign to me. I couldn't believe that this was actually happening. I was like, this is not the England that at least I was aware of. And lo and behold, right, these same things are happening here in the US. And so this conversation, I think, is really, I think there's a lot that our colleagues in London, at UCL, can teach us around how they were able to navigate a conservative government, a government that there was lots of backlash against race. And I think that they are now trying to do some of the work that we were able to do, I think some of the progressive work during clearly the Biden administration. So now that there is a Labor or a Democratic government, they're looking for how you can center race now in their teaching, in their preparation of teachers. So if you're around and if you are wanting to think more globally, I'm inviting you to join this conversation. All right. I think I'm done. I'm tired. Thank you.